Hi everybody, it's Courtney with Honeybee Stamps, and today we're going to be making a one-layer slimline card using the Happy BEEday stamp set. You can see that I have all of my masks pre-cut from Simon's stamp masking paper, and I went ahead and put my panel down into my MISTI and just laid out my masks just to kind of get placement so I know where I want to stamp everything. Now, you'll notice that a lot of these images are pretty intricate, and normally they'd be a little bit difficult to cut the masks from. But I didn't really be overly careful, like the areas between the little candles. I wasn't even going to try to cut in between those. But in the end, even after our ink blending and our coloring is done, I'll show you how to easily fix that so nobody ever notices the difference. So once I have my masks all laid out the way I wanted them, then I can replace those masks with the actual stamps from the stamp set. You'll just want to make sure that you're paying attention to what images are going to be in front of another, because those will need to be stamped and masked first. So I went ahead and stamped this first layer of stamps with the Blackout ink by Ink on 3 because it's a Copic safe ink. Now there's a ton of images and there's not a whole lot that overlaps in my card. I kept it pretty simple, but I am still using the masks because I'm going to do ink blending in the background. So I ended up having to stamp these twice just because there's so many of them. And then I will go ahead and mask those out. Now some of them are, well, I would say most of them are going to be one mask for each image. However, there were a few that there was, I guess you could say, gaps in between the two images within one stamp, if that makes any sense. So I just cut two separate masks. So for example, the bear that is holding the balloon, I cut the bear separate and the balloon separate. The little bee here that is holding the flower is separate and the bee is separate. And you'll also notice that I didn't bother to cut out the wings because the wings would be transparent anyway. So I want a little bit of the background to show right through those wings. So once I had my first layer of stamps down, as well as the masks down, then I just have this little squirrel here that is going to be a little bit in front of this present, and he's going to kind of be looking up at that one bee. So I stamped and masked him out, and then I'm going to add the branches. These are going to hang off a little bit. Well, they're not really going to hang off, but in order to have enough room, I had to kind of shift my paper around to make sure that I could stamp these, and these are super intricate. I did cut one single mask for each of these, and the best way to lay these out is to find one of those intricate areas. So in this case, I just picked one of the flowers, made sure that that part was lined up and held that down with my finger while I lined up the rest of the mask. Sometimes you kind of have to play with it a little bit, but because these branches are so thin, you can kind of manipulate the masking paper and kind of bend it into the places that you actually need it to be. Now, there was a little bit of an area that off to the sides where my stamp was a little bit shorter than I wanted my branch to be. So I'm just tearing off two little pieces of Post-it note tape to fill in those areas, and I'll just fill those blank areas in with a Copic safe pen and do my coloring, and nobody's ever going to notice the difference. Now, I hear a lot of you guys, especially on my channel, tell me that they can't build scenes because they can't draw. You don't have to be able to draw. I can't draw. So I am doing absolutely no additions to this card except for the stamped images and some ink blending. You'll notice that I'm not doing any masking. I didn't draw any lines separating the ground or the sky. I'm just going to add some color. So I added a little bit of the cracked pistachio at the very bottom portion of my card panel, and then I'll blend that out just a little bit with the twisted citron, and this will basically be my grass. I did have to go back in with the peacock feathers a little bit just to have a little bit more variation in color, but it depends on what colors you're using. I wanted to keep my background fairly light. So then I can move on to the sky, and I'm going to start off with the broken china, and I'm not adding a ton of ink to my blending brush here, and that's mainly because I want to go in small sections and I want to gradually build up my color for two reasons. Number one, you'll get a better blend, And number two, these masks are so tiny. So when you have these little tiny areas of masking, they like to lift as you're doing your ink blending. So I figured if I'm just going with a very light hand and gradually adding that ink, then I have a better chance of them sticking in place. So I moved on to the tumbled glass, and I just extended those areas down a little bit. And I'm also going to get this tumbled glass to start blending with that twisted citron. So I'm going to have more of a seamless blend from the grass to the sky. And that way you don't have to worry about masking or drawing anything to separate these areas. They're just going to blend together. I did have to add a little bit more of that broken china just to get a little bit more variation in color for the sky, and blended that out quickly with the tumbled glass. And I did put this panel aside to dry for about 20 minutes or so. You probably don't have to wait that long, but you do want the ink to be at least somewhat dry before you remove your masks, because it's paper. And when they get wet, it likes to tear, and when the masks tear, sometimes your card panel does as well. So once that was dry, I went ahead and removed my masks. If they're really stuck down, which most of mine were, you can use the tip of your scissors to kind of get them started. If your mask starts to tear, let it tear. Don't try to work that out, because you'll have a better chance of saving your actual card panel. You can always go back in and clean up those areas. Now, you'll also notice as I'm peeling off the masks, some of them either A, weren't cut correctly because they are so intricate, or they just weren't lined up correctly. And some of those black outlines of the images, they're not so black anymore. I use Distress Oxides, which are more of an opaque ink, so it tends to tone down everything it goes over, including those black outlines. But before I start my coloring, and you can always do this after your coloring or during your coloring, whenever you feel like it, I went over some of those areas that I kind of lost because of the ink with the Copic Safe pen. Now I'm using an EK Success journaling pen, which are no longer available, but I will link something that is comparable below as far as the quality as well as the price. So I'll link it below. I've used it only once. I just have so many of these EK Success journaling pens, I figured I may as well use them up, and I really do love them. So I'm going over the balloon string and the outline of the balloon itself, just some of the areas that I just lost those black lines, especially the little legs and the outline of the wings for the bees. And as I went along, I went ahead and continued doing this as I found more areas that were not so bold anymore. And we also have some gaps between the images and the background itself. So you'll see like white outlines around some of the images, and that's just because the masks weren't cut correctly or they weren't lined up correctly, but we'll fix those at the very end. So once I had all of these outlines done, we can move on to the coloring, and the coloring took a little bit of time. So I did speed this up a little bit more than I normally do. And I honestly didn't show you all of it, but I at least showed you all of the color combinations I used. So I'm going to start off with this, tree stump, I guess you would call it. I'm going to go in with my lightest color, which is the E53, just to map out those darkest areas. I'm just using the lines that are within the image to kind of guide me as far as where my shadows should be. Those little vertical lines, that's where I added some shadows. And when one little section, I guess you could call it, of the stump is behind another, I also added a shadow there. Also added a little bit of shading to the back of the top of it, because the further back an object gets, the darker it will appear. I am blending those areas out with an E57, E55, and then I'll finish off with that E53 that we started with. Now I'm using the same color combination for the tree branches as well, and I'm only going to show you one of these because it is pretty repetitive. Now these are skinny. The little branches are quite thin. So I'm not really too picky as far as where I put my shading. I do know that the largest part of the branch, I do want to definitely add shading there because I have room to do so. And I'm just going to add a little bit on the top and a little bit more on the bottom, just because that would be more in shadow. But for the branches that are kind of coming off the large branch, I'm not really too concerned about where I'm putting shading. As long as there's a variation in color, nobody's really ever going to know. And they are tiny areas, and you want to just make sure that your colors don't bleed. It's very hard to remove Copic marker off of a Distress ink background. So moving on to this little squirrel here, I'm going to use some cool gray markers. I know that there's different colors of squirrels, but all my squirrels here in New York are gray. So I'm just adding a little bit of shading with the C7, which is pretty dark gray. So I'm using that pretty sparingly. And then I'll blend that out with the C5, C3, and C1. The grays tend to blend really nicely, so I don't necessarily always feel the need to go in with my lightest color to saturate the paper first. I find that they blend enough where I don't need to waste my time doing that. So I'm going to bring out an R02, which is kind of like a peachy, pinky color, and I am just going to add 2 little dots to his cheeks and a little bit to his belly and the inside of his ears. Next, I'm going to move on to this little bunny here, and I'm going to switch over to some warm grays. Now, I'm going to leave some white space here. My warm grays have seen better days. They are starting to get a little bit dry, so I'm using them very, very sparingly here. But I'm starting with the W5, blending that out with the W3 and W1. And you'll see that I am leaving some white space because I want this little bunny to be significantly lighter. So in order to get rid of that area between the W1 and the white paper, I'm just taking my colorless blender, but I'm only going over the white area. I'm not going over the colored area, and this will just give you a more of a seamless blend. Again, I'm going to use that R02 for the cheeks and the inside of the ears, and we'll move on to the bear. And I'm only going to show you one of these because I colored them very, very similar and with the same color combination. But I'm starting off with that lightest color to map out my darkest areas. For his little snout, I guess you'd say, I'm adding a little bit of shading on the top of it, but I'm also adding a little bit of shading to the bottom of the snout itself. So on his face above the snout and then on the bottom of the snout, just to have a little bit of variation, and I can kind of tell the difference between the two areas. So I'm also adding a shadow underneath his hat. And I'm just paying attention to where one part of his body is behind the other. So his little arms are behind him. So that's going to cast a shadow. Also where his belly would be hanging over his legs a little bit, that would also cast a shadow. Now for his belly, this is a separate part of the image, and I want it to not necessarily blend in with the rest of him, but I do want to use the same colors. So I am not going to use the darkest color here. I'm only going to use the darkest mid-tone, add a little bit of shading on either side, and just leave a larger highlight area. That way it stands out a little bit, but it's the same color. Added a little color to his cheeks and the darkest E79 for his nose, and I used a white gel pen to fill back in his eyes. Next, for the bees, I'm going to use a yellow and orange combination. Yellows can be a little tough when you're trying to do shading, so I always, if I want it bright, I usually bring it in an YR marker. If I want it more of a golden yellow, I'll bring in an E marker, but I'm just using a 4-color blend there, and I did the same thing for the other bee. For the remaining stripes, I'm going to bring in a black marker and a couple of C markers, and I'm just adding a little bit of shading to the top and the bottom because his body would be a round object, so it would have a pretty strong center highlight. And so I'm going to finish off with the C3, which is pretty light. So next, of course, I added some color to their cheeks as well. For the flowers, I'm going to bring in some RV markers, and I'm going to go right in with my darkest color because these flowers are so tiny and RVs can be tough sometimes. I want to go right in with my darkest color to avoid oversaturation and having them bleed out into my background. For the leaves, I'm going to switch over to some YG markers, and once I added my lightest color, I kind of lost the contrast. So I went back in with the darker YG marker and I just didn't blend it out, and I was able to get a little contrast. You could probably just use one color here. They are pretty tiny. For the beehive, I am going to start off with that lightest color, the Y23, add a little bit of shading to both sides because, again, this would be a round object. I also added a little bit of shading under each one of the little sections. And honestly, the E15 and the YR27 are so similar, I couldn't even tell the difference. So I could have probably avoided using one of them. Use a W7 just for the inside or the opening, I guess you could say, of the little beehive. So next I'm going to color in everything else. But like I said, I'm not going to show you all of it, but I'm just going to show you a couple of things just so that you could see the color combinations that I used throughout the entire card. And I just repeated the same color combinations over and over. For the balloon, I'm adding a highlight off to I'm adding a shadow, I guess, off to the right-hand side. And that's where I'll actually put my white gel pen details just to kind of boost that up a little bit. I also used a BG combination and the RV combination that I used for the flowers, just to kind of keep everything bright. I avoided using blues and greens because I didn't want them to blend in with the background. So once everything was colored, you can see that I have a ton of gaps here for those white outlines. So I'm going to bring out my Copic chart and kind of match up the background with a marker that I have. So you want to go a little bit lighter. So if there's like two, like a B12 and a B14, I was kind of iffy about which one to use. I started with the B12. If it is a little bit too light, then go darker. But if you go with the darker option first and it doesn't really work out, you're kind of stuck. So start off light. If it doesn't work, then bring in the darker color. But it seemed to work pretty well. I did have to bring in the B14 a little bit for the top area where that broken china was, just because that area was a little bit darker to begin with. But for the most part, I was able to fill in all of those gaps, and you can't tell the difference. For the wings of the bees, I used a Nuvo Aqua Shimmer pen just to go over the wings, and this will kind of remove a little bit of the ink, but also add some shimmer. So there is a differentiation between the wings and the rest of the background, but you can still see through them. I also added some white gel pen details to some random areas, just to add a little bit of a highlight, and this will really boost up your coloring as well. So again, this is a Slimline card. So I have a card base here, and I'm going to use some fun foam to pop this panel up. So I have the fun foam that has adhesive on one side, so I'm going to stick that down to my panel and then bring out some score tape. I've used wet glue on fun foam a lot because I prefer wet glue, but honestly, it just doesn't work that well, at least not the kind that I have. So I'm finding that the score tape works a lot better. It's stuck immediately. I don't have to put it under something heavy for, 20 minutes to make it stick. And you'll see my card base is not very flat. And my bone folder, my mother has my bone folder at the moment. So I'm going to use a spoon, just a spoon from my kitchen, and it seems to work pretty well. Not quite as well as the bone folder, but if you don't have one, or you've misplaced yours or let somebody borrow yours like I did, try to use a spoon. I didn't have any issue at all. So I went ahead and lined up my panel, just leaving a very, very small white outline on all four sides, and that will really make your card panel pop as well. And of course, I didn't leave room for my sentiment, so I'm going to stamp that on the inside of the card along with there's 3 bees in the set, so I'm going to use the other bee as well just to add a little bit of something to the inside. I'm stamping both of these with VersaFine Onyx Black ink, and that is it. That is the card for today. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thanks so much for stopping by, and have a great day.